In this video, I'm going to go through my process for mastering, but before we get started, my name is Ed, you're watching Stokes Sounds, and if you like this video, please make sure that you hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment, and if you want to support the channel, head over to our website, stokessounds.com. Now let's dive in. So I've got a track here by an artist called Moses, and I mixed this song, and I also mastered it. Now, I don't always master the songs that I mix, but sometimes I will, and that just could be because the artist wants me to, or the team wants me to, or there isn't a budget to have a separate mastering engineer. So over the years of mixing, I have learned just to master a lot of the mixes that I work on. And so I want to talk about my process and how I kind of go through it. And I do feel like there is a little bit of a misconception about mastering. People just think it's just making things louder, but there is a little bit more to it. But let's dive in and let's see kind of what mastering is all about. I'm going to play the track first so you can hear it. So you can kind of hear what we're working with there. And, you know, it's got a real nice bottom end. It gives me that Charlie Puth attention kind of vibes. And I think that was the reference on this track. And he wanted to get that kind of bass and that kick to really kind of punch hard. And a lot of that is to do with the mix, but the mastering kind of just gives it that kind of 2% polish. Now, if we take a listen with the mastering off. So you can hear it's a lot quieter, but don't let that trick you. There is a lot more to mastering than just kind of loudness. And I think that's a lot of people's conception of what mastering is. They think, oh, it's just about making things loud. But it's also about kind of making things translate onto other systems. So if you play this in the club or you play it in your car, it's going to translate well. So there's a little bit of give and take in the mastering process to kind of get the best of both worlds. With this song, because I mixed it, I mastered it in the same session. Now, if I'm getting a song where I'm just mastering, or I'm getting kind of a collection of songs to kind of master, I'll do it in a separate session just because of workflow reasons. But in this case, I decided to do it all on the mix bus because I mixed a single. So if we take a look at what it is that I'm actually doing on the mix bus, you can see here that I've got some plugins bypassed and some that are active. Now, the ones that are active are the ones that I mixed into. So these were on at the start of the mix, which is why I'm not turning them off now, because it will collapse the mix. And then the ones that are bypassed, that's the mastering stage. But if we just take a quick look at what I actually did on the mix bus as well. First up, I've got the vintage drive. This is just giving me some harmonic saturation on the overall mix, and I'm using the SSL Fusion for that. Then I go into my mix bus compressor, which in this case, it's the FG Grey Slate compressor. Absolutely love this. This is kind of providing my glue. And you can see here, I've got it on a slow attack, fast release. And that's because, you know, Mendel, the artist, said to me, he goes, I want this to sound like Charlie Puth attention. I want it to have a lot of transient, you know, and I want it to be really punchy. And by using these settings, it kind of made the overall mix, the kick and the bass, sit kind of really punchy, and it didn't lose the transient on the compression. So that's why I did that. And then I go into the Amic 200 EQ, and this is just doing a smiley face boost at the bottom, boost on the high end. I got it on around 50 hertz and to 20k, and this is just kind of shaping the overall mix together. And then I'm using the SSL stereo image plugin, again by Fusion, and this is just kind of spreading harmonically from around 280 up, just to add a little bit more width to the mix. And yeah, it sounded good, so I went with it. Now, if we actually look at the mastering stage of where this kind of came into it, first up, I use Ozone, and in this case, it's Ozone 10. Now, the first thing I've got going on is EQ. I ended up not doing much. I've got a tiny boost at half a dB at 15k, and that's just given me kind of the gloss, the kind of sheen, the pop sheen people like, that really nice bright, high end. Now, you're probably noticing I'm only doing half a dB, and that's what mastering is. It's very, very small things that add up to a big thing. I'm not doing drastic EQ changes or, doing crazy things when it comes down to this stage. Now, if I'm just doing it on the mix bus, there might be some crazy, mix bus processing going on. But because we're now in the mastering stage, the mix is done. Everything I do here is just tiny things just to give me that extra 2%. So I've got a little bit of half a dB at 15k, and that's just giving me some brightness. If we just have a listen with this EQ on and off, it's very, very subtle, but let's do it. And then I go into a multiband dynamic compression, and this tool you have to be very careful with. You can really ruin a mix with it. But the reason why I decided to go with this was because of the bass and the kick. The artist Mendel said that he wanted it really forward and really punchy, and you have to be careful that when you play that on smaller systems, one, it might not translate, and two, it might just literally just blow up the speaker and completely distort and just sound horrible. So this is just kind of doing maybe half a dB, maybe even less, and it's just really pushing down up to around 143 hertz down. Just if it gets a little bit too much, it's a bit like massaging it, and it's just pulling it down slightly. Now, if we take a listen with this dynamics module on and off so we can hear what this is doing. So you can see there, again, it's really, really subtle stuff. It's just kind of just massaging it and just making it just sit a little bit tighter. And as I say, mastering to me is just giving this extra 2% of kind of gloss at the end of the mix. Then if we look at the next module, which is a dynamic EQ, now this is actually really important what this is doing. I felt like when I was, applying the mastering process, that there was a little bit of a build up around 205 hertz in this case. And, some people say, you need to go back to the mix, you need to find where that is and reduce it and all of that sort of stuff. And that's fine to do that. But sometimes it's not necessarily one single thing that's causing a build up in that frequency. It could be multiple things. And that's where I like to do it on the master. And again, you won't see me do more than -2 dB on a master, more than that on anything really, unless, if it's more than going past -2 dB of a reduction of some sort, I probably would go back to the mix because it probably is actually a problem. If I was the one that was mixing it as well, I would double check that. And here again, around 205 hertz, and then I've got a smaller dip at around 336 at 1 dB. So these frequencies are more like the muddy frequencies, the ones that create boxiness. So that's why I'm doing that there. And then I've got one at 2.8k, 1 dB. My ears are very sensitive to the 2.8k, 3k mark, and I feel like it's always that kind of, again, give and take. You want your vocals to be bright and sharp, but you also don't want, it to affect the hi-hats, and everything just sounds a bit brittle. I always feel like that kind of frequency is like the cheap frequency. If there's too much of 3k, it just sounds nasty. And so, I felt like that I wanted to take that out at -1 dB at that point, so I did. And then here's an interesting one. Although I boosted on this EQ, I felt like after adding the dynamics and then doing more dynamic EQ that it was a little bit kind of top heavy. And so I felt like I needed to kind of reduce a little bit at the high end. So it kind of looks like I'm counteracting myself. But again, I just went with feel, and I just went with what feels good. When you boost a plugin and you take away with another plugin, it's a different kind of tonal sound than it is if you just didn't boost it to begin with and you just left it as it was. So, again, it's kind of push and pull the whole time. And as it's dynamic, it's not happening every moment. It's happening in just certain parts when it's, hitting harder and it hits that threshold and it reduces it. So if we have a listen with the dynamic EQ on and off, you'll hear what this is doing. You can hear it's just controlling those frequencies that I just felt like there was a build up at a time. And, you know, some people might be asking or thinking, why am I not just doing it on the general EQ? Why am I doing it on the dynamic EQ? And again, that goes back to what I said. If I did these kind of normal moves on the normal EQ without it being dynamic, it would mean that I'm taking it out on the verses, on the choruses, on the mid late. And sometimes there will be a build up of around, you know, 200 to 300 hertz on the chorus because there's more instruments coming in than there is on, let's say, verse 1. And so I really don't want to be taking things out on verse 1 when I don't need to be. So, you know, that's why I did it in dynamic. And then next up, I've got the maximizer. And the maximizer in this case, I'm just kind of controlling the transients, the peaks in the song. Now, you know, a maximizer is very different to a clipper. A clipper shaves off the transients, where a limiter will kind of just make it a little bit kind of, it will just squash the transients, so it won't be shaving them off. So in this case, I didn't want to have the clipping sound. I just wanted to kind of just control the peaks more so than shave them off. So that's why my threshold and my ceiling is the same, and I bring that down, and that's probably doing maybe 1 dB. And again, it's just giving me more control of the transients before I then go into my clipper. So again, as you saw there, it's less than 2 dB of reduction. And as I say, this is just more control, so I can push this song super loud without it kind of crapping out and causing a problem at the end. Then after that, I then go into a clipper. And I love the T-Rex clipper. And this is what is, one, giving me volume, and two, again, this is shaving transients off and giving me some saturation on the overall mix. And this is so that when I go into my final limiter, it's not working as hard to get it louder. Now, if we have a look at what this clipper is doing, I will leave it on and then I'll turn it off, and then you'll hear what it's doing. You can hear there, it's adding a lot. It's adding volume. It's kind of making things sound a bit kind of more punchier and a bit thicker. And so I went with this clipper for this, you know, this track. I liked it and it was working well. Then if we look at the final limiter, that is the Pro L2 by FabFilter. And again, I'm using this purely for volume and to bring it up to commercial level. You know, Mendel said to me he wanted it like Charlie Puth. And, you know, if you want to have your track kind of at a commercial volume with the Charlie Puth standard, you need to be hitting around -6 to -7 LUFS. And so I used the clipper before the limiter to make the limiter work less hard. So let's have a listen with this limiter on and with it off so you can hear what it's doing. Now, as you can see there, that is a lot of limiting going on, a little bit more than I probably usually would. It's around 5 or 6 dB gain reduction. Now, usually I aim for around 3 or 4, but because I needed to get this up to kind of super loud commercial volume, I really had to drive it. Now, that is one of the reasons why I like to put a clipper before the limiter. Now, if the clipper wasn't before the limiter, it means I'd have to work the Pro L2 even harder. And you're going to start, you know, getting into problems there. It's going to start crapping out, distorting, and it's not going to sound very pleasant. Now, as you saw there, I'm driving that limiter quite hard. I'm doing around 5 or 6 dB gain reduction, which is a lot more than I usually would. But to get it to that loudness, that was something I had to do. And so again, it's a give or take thing. You have to drive things to make things loud, or you you have to pull back low end again to make things loud. So in this case, I did drive it quite hard, but it sounded good to my ear, and so it was absolutely fine. But the super important thing about this chain is the clipper was before the limiter. Now, if the clipper wasn't before the limiter's going to crap out, because I'm going to have to drive it so much to get it to a -6.3 LUFS integrated kind of volume that it's not going to be able to cope, and it's going to sound horrible. So that clipper, by shaving off 1 or 2 dB of the transients, is allowing me to really drive this limiter and it to still sound okay. And it's just, again, just not working as hard. If we actually have a look at the clipper and limiter together and play the track, and I'm going to take the clipper off, and you'll see what happens. There will be a volume change, but you'll see that the limiter, I'm going to have to drive this up to get it to the same volume. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have the clipper off completely, and as you saw, it's hitting around the 6 dB of gain reduction mark at 7.4 gain going in. If I now turn the clipper off, I'm going to have to drive the gain up going into the plugin to get it to around the same spot. Let's try that. So as you saw there, without having the clipper before, I'm really having to drive this, +11 going into the limiter to enable to get it to the same loudness that I had when I had the clipper in. And so for me, it's really important to kind of share the volume load on different plugins and using different tools for different things. A clipper will shave off the transients where a limiter will kind of squash them, so it's a different kind of sound. And so for me, I would much rather shave off the transients, 1 or 2 dB of clipping, and then making my limiter work less, because to me it will allow me to get things louder, but also not just louder, but also it's sounding nicer to the ear. I feel like when you really kind of crap out a limiter, it just doesn't sound very nice. You get a lot of distortion, and to me it just sounds a bit crunchy. Well, when you do it with a clipper, because you're shaving off the transients, it just means that it's not as squashed, and it just has a little bit more energy to my ear and a bit more of a pleasant tone. And so that's why I always like to use a clipper before a limiter, before my final limiter, to get the volume. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to leave what you think in the comments, and any future videos that you also want, please leave them down there too. I do read them all. And also check the description below. We have lots of free stuff and lots of links for you guys to check out as well regarding mixing, and I'll see you all again next week for another video.